Hi, Ray. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to get your insight on how the whole Huawei chip and Nvidia chip kind of conversation is going. There's a
Mhm.
lot of media interest in this, and I think, I would love to understand actually how the technology really works behind all of this.
Mhm.
Why don't I just start with the first question? So, it is said that Huawei's Ascend 910C will replace NVIDIA's H20 because that the Zen 910C is legit just going to be the only chip that Chinese AI companies can get their hands on if there's a H20 ban, or is it frankly at this point advanced enough and actually just a really quality product, advanced chip, high performance and cheaper alternative that even without a ban, Chinese AI companies will likely choose to go with that chip anyway.
Yeah. So I think there's enough noise between H20 and S and 910B or 910C, right? But to really look at a benchmark of all this hardware, you can tell that H20 right now is still the better hardware in terms of both hardware and software capability. On the hardware side, even though H20 offers less computational performance compared to 910C, it offers much better memory bandwidth, right? And memory bandwidth right now is extremely pivotal for inference training, which is the key element for reasoning models, the most important models right now. So H20, to my understanding, still is the best options for a lot of AI companies or cloud service providers in China, including Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, BBAT, and ByteDance, right? So this is very clear to me, and there's a data I saw. Most of the, well, I won't say most of the, majority of the inference training right now in China over the past couple quarters is actually done by H20 instead of 910C, right? And for H20, it offers much better ability to scale up as a clusters and eventually go to the data center. And if you are the companies that you want to train your models, you want to train it on the best hardware with the best software that your engineer can code on code on the hardware, right? So to my understanding right now, H20 is still a much better choice for CSP or other AI companies in China. But because right now there's the recent ban on H20, it will potentially force Chinese companies to have no options, right? So they can only go to Huawei's 910C or even Chemicron's ASICs. And that's the problem that I believe really um, sort of bothers me because you are really leave Chinese companies no options, right? They can only use latency. And to kind of elaborate a little more on latency, there's a reason a lot of noise about cloud metrics that is built on tons of chips of latencies. I think Cloud Matrix, if you look at their benchmark compared to the NVL72, which is a rack level solution of Nvidia, they basically put multiple chips together as a rack scale solution. And they compare both these two hardware benchmark, and they tell like, oh, the Cloud Matrix is have better performance, better memory performance, blah blah blah. But remember, Cloud Matrix is a system that combined with a lot more chips than NVL72. And it also, if you look at the cost, it's like 5 times more expensive than NVL72, right? So if you are Huawei, you want to scale up the whole cloud metric system will be extremely expensive. And you can see the price of that cloud metric system will be very expensive for the customer. But right now, if you leave those customer no options, they can only buy Huawei, right? Huawei is right now still the best domestic solution in terms of AI hardware. Yeah, I will leave it here for any follow-up questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think even some analysis put out a report a couple weeks ago saying that it would just be extremely costly in terms of energy and just money. But then I think they had a little tagline saying, I guess that's not an issue for China anyway, but
Right.
it's not good enough for environment, and no one wants to pay more for the same kind of result, right? So
Yeah.
that's interesting. But I want to understand. So let's just say the ban really happens. What is the actual business implication of it? For one, it will be more costly for these companies to continue to train their models, to use it for inference. What else can we actually expect? Would it be like, I don't know, and explain the technicalities to me. Would it be more lagging in terms of user experience? Would it be a poor user experience? How does it actually affect the actual usage of AI?
Yeah. I think this is the part I think a lot of people misunderstand, right? The way we train AI, we train on the hardware, the existing hardware that the company have. And if you look at BBAT, all the four companies, they have the inventories of the GPU from Nvidia, AMD have 100,000 of GPUs, right? And then even you cut off the H20, to my understanding, they already obtained more than 1.5 million H20 before the ban, right? And those GPU is not going to just disappear. They can still use those GPUs. And also the GPU like H100, H200, H800, they purchased before the ASPO controls. Or even some of them is illegally purchased after the ASPO control, right? So all those AI models can still continue being trained in the next few years. And if you think about the GPU clusters, its life cycle, you typically sustain about 4 to 5 years, right? So those existing hardware can still train Chinese AI models. So I don't think Chinese AI model developments will decline or undermine in the next few years, given their existing hardware. I think the ban on H20 that really impacts the growth of Chinese compute capacity, right? Because you cut off one key source of their compute resources. That's the impact I think it will lies on. I don't think it will impact on Chinese AI model developments in the next few years, right? And think about this, right? Right now they couldn't have the hardware that better than H20, but they already have so much hardware that either better or equivalent as Nvidia's H20. So they continue to train the next few years, given their inventories. But I believe Huawei will develop a hardware maybe let's say 2 to 3 years after the hardware will better than H20. I think it's sort of it's a reasonable prediction, right? So if that happens, essentially those market share go to Huawei customer because they don't have choice, and their inventory will eventually depreciate it. So they will buy more customer solution from Huawei and eventually deploy those hardware in their data center. And a lot of AI model in the next 3 to 5 years or 5 to 8 years will train on Huawei's hardware. And that's a concern that Nvidia, AMD will really have, right? And they have built a very strong GPU ecosystem in China. Most of the developers adopt Nvidia's hardware instead of Huawei, and most of them just build on Nvidia. And that's the problem I think Nvidia really has, because it's about ecosystem, about adoptions, instead of like, hey, this is just pure benchmark, pure about individual chips performance. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, to add one point, I think Jensen has been very, very concerned. I think he's been more outspoken, like after the H20 ban, right? He's constantly saying like it's important to having the presence in Chinese market, important to having that ecosystem, and not about hardware ecosystem, but also the software ecosystem. And they don't want to give out their key advantage, because the key advantage they have in China, it's a broad diffusion deployments. And Chinese engineer, let's be honest, like they are just familiar with Nvidia's hardware. Nvidia hardware, it's already launched way back to 2007. All right, and we are just talking about GPU here. There's also the part about consumer graphics cards, right? A lot of developers also using CUDA in graphics cards, and they want to keep that without the access, and being capped about the ability to enter or continue to have a competitive presence in China really costs Nvidia a lot of market potential. Yeah. Yeah, so just to give sort of like brief pre-context of CUDA, right? CUDA really launched in 2007. Initially, it was mostly for scientific or research purpose, but later on realized, oh, could be a great add-on their hardware, because they basically allow developers to code in specific purpose, right? Whether you are using for AI model training, you are doing for scientific research, or you are doing more general purpose, research or other technology purpose. And that really launched much earlier than the whole CANN that launched by Huawei in over the past few years, right? So you can kind of assume, and you consider Nvidia's global presence, you can tell like a lot of developers will easily prefer Nvidia's hardware right now, and there's a lot better adoptions in US, in China, in any place in the world. And the key advantage, that's number one, right? The diffusion and the deployment. And the second, if you look at CUDA, they are not just like, this is not a software that only support GPU, the things we'll talk about like H100, H200, H800. It also support the consumer graphic cards, right? The RTX 3060, RTX 4090s, even the recent one, RTX 5090s. And this is the part that they differentiate themselves. If you look at Huawei's CNN, it actually only support Essence 910 series or Essence chips in general, right? And that's a big differentiator, because if you're a consumer today, hey, like I want to have a graphic cards, for example, right? Huawei don't really sell graphic cards, so I can only purchase from Nvidia. And that actually helped Nvidia to build out their ecosystem even more broadly instead of only focus on high performance computing. Yeah, and if also think about I think CAM also offer, they work with a couple software within the platform, because the CUDA is actually like a platform, and they cooperate with, they can do in PyTorch, TensorFlow, and apparently developers can easily do in Python instead of any optimized solutions that CAM need to work with. Yeah.
So that's really interesting. And I think, could you actually go into a bit more detail? Like, how does it really work in terms of you saying CUDA just offers a better experience of a platform? Not only does it support more like various kinds of chips, but in terms of the actual developer who's on the platform using it, how does experience differ?
Yeah, I think number one, right now the CUDA system is already cooperating with a lot of libraries, right? The libraries, the typically the developers libraries is basically like, it's like a resources that you can use it and to continue whether it's code and how you're gonna develop your apps or applications in different purposes. And that's the thing that Huawei has continued to work on over the past few years, because you really need those libraries, comprehensive libraries, and cooperate with like other software. I couldn't really go into like technical details, but to having that sort of broader ecosystem where different software or applications together for the developers, right? Because every developers, let's be honest, everyone have different purpose. But not everyone want to do high performance computing, right? If you just want to do high performance computing, that actually don't really make sense, because before the whole ChatGPT stuff, before not everyone is using GPU for high performance computing, AI model training. Yeah.
I have a different question actually, just shying away from this topic a little bit. Um, how does it all work? We know that there's the various chip players in China right now. How does Huawei, SMIC, like all these different like so-called comparable or China solution to, AMD, TSMC, all the, you know, equipment or companies that they don't have access to. How do they work together? How do they compare to the Western counterparts? Can you explain that to us a little bit?
Yeah, I think number one, so for SMX, so I think it's better to start with SMIC because that's the most important chip making arm for Huawei, right? So both companies right now is already under significant export control, being put on entity list, right? And beside, like even those their equipment suppliers is also on the entity list. So they are basically facing broader regulatory challenges since 2020, right? Huawei being added on entity list in, I think it was September 2020. SMIC, I think also it's maybe the same year or the year after. Also other like memory makers like YMTC, CSMT. CSMT haven't been on entity list, but YMTC is already on entity list, right? So for SMIC, mostly what they do is today Huawei they want a chips. They make the chip design. They work with like firm called Hill Silicon. It's like a chip design arm for Huawei, right? So SMIC get a design from Huawei and Silicon, and they make the chips for either smartphone and most recently on the high performance computing chips like SM GPUs. So that's what SMIC do. Of course, they're also doing other their business. They're doing legacy chips or more mature. To put it simply, it's like less advanced chips, right? And those chips go to consumer electronics, refrigerator, watches, stuff like that. So that's other their business portfolio. See, so their business is not just only about Huawei, but also other consumer electronics. They maybe work with other fabulous companies in China. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's mostly what SMIC do. And on the equipment export control, just to add a little more context, they have been banned from to have the access to EUV from ASML. I think it's way back to 2019 under the first Trump administration. Then that really limits their capability to scale up the production of advanced chips. Why I mean advanced chips? Typically, we are saying under 7 nanometers, right? They are struggle to scale up the 7 nanometers production and also have a, I would say, commercially viable yield for 7 nanometers chips. Their yield probably maybe about 40% to 50%, which is not really the yield that you want as a chip makers. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think for non-technical people, like there's a lot of information online that just is really hard for us to digest, and you just really broke it down to us really, really easily, which is great. Thank you. Um, I just want to end this actually. I want to wrap it really quickly, but wondering, is there anything we're really missing here? There's a lot of headlines about Huawei being banned, Nvidia is going to be replaced. Like you and I were just talking about, Huawei's been on the NC list for a couple of years now, so they've been preparing for this, in many ways become more and more self-reliant. So, like, what are we missing here that people are not talking about, or how is this really going to affect the bigger AI development globally, like looking forward?
Yeah, I think two things. I think maybe start with SMIC and Huawei, right? SMIC, we know it used to be basically it's the sole manufacturer for the chips for Huawei, right? And recently, I'm not sure you read it. Huawei is also reportedly building their own fabs. Fabs, it's like a factory that manufacturing chips. They are also building their own, which is very interesting, and it's actually being reported a year before by Bloomberg. I think what Huawei is trying to do right now, as I mentioned, SMIC is facing significant challenges when it comes to scale up the production of advanced chips, like 7 nanometers chips, and even go under 7 nanometers, right? And if you are Huawei as a customer, you want to have a stable and reliable partners when it comes to chip making. Because even though you have let's assuming you have the best design in China, right? But if you don't, you couldn't have the chips that are being manufactured. For them, it's just like, hey, like we have the best design, and we couldn't work with TSMC, right? Because of the entity status. So what Huawei, I believe, is trying to do is that we want to have a dual production sources, right? One is with SMIC, another one is sort of in-house manufacturing. So I think this is Huawei is trying to do right now, is that, well, on one side, we want to outsource to SMIC, and we also want to build our own capacity to see whether we can do better in terms of yield, in terms of production capacity, right? And when you build more fabs in-house in Huawei, you also, number one, you increase production capacity. Two, it increase the potential capability to go under 7 nanometers. Three, you create competition, which I think is very important, because for SMIC, they're like, hey, like we basically monopoly the Huawei's orders, right? Now you create competition that will potentially sort of facilitates the innovation, the management capability in SMIC. And those are very important developments right now. And for Huawei's chips, this is very important to mention that they are constantly suffering the constraint in production capacity for their AI chips, right? So even assuming they have the very good GPUs, they have the best GPUs domestically, right? But if you couldn't scale up, right? If you are the CSP, right now they are purchasing chips in 1 million units, right? And in that sense, like it's hard for them to really fulfill the customer demand. And that's the thing I think really challenged them. And they try to expand the capacity. But I think the problem for whether SMIC or Huawei is that they're constantly being constrained by semiconductor manufacturing equipment. All those control come over the past 5 years. And we will see how they can potentially overcome this. My sense is that they will constantly face constraint because of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment's control. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I thank you for just explaining that to us as well. I don't have any more questions, but is there anything else you want to talk about or highlight and or just share with everyone on AI Pro M?
Yeah, I think that's about it. Perhaps one thing I would just encourage everyone to read AI Proem's article, especially some of the article I've read. It's some of the best I've read, whether it's on Substack or in mainstream media. I would really encourage people, especially the piece about DeepSeek, the piece about Tencent, the piece about Alibaba. It's very important to understand the industry developments right now in China and how they diffuse AI technology from the enterprise level to the customer level. And there's an article how they talk about like how the strategy changed with AI startup in China. And those are the very important trends that we really need to understand. And we can potentially take a lesson from it, right? And right now, Chinese and US AI industry is basically sort of decoupled, right? But it's also very important to both sides to learn each other to, push the boundaries of AI deployment, AI innovation, and to build out the beta AI to benefit their own country or build the benefit to the whole world. Yeah.
Thank you so much.